never been there. We went when the rabbi was in Chicago.
All right, guys, we're learning Torah today. We're learning Torah. Let's do this. Welcome to you, Chuck. Good morning, Dan, Rob, Marty, and anybody else that's with us. Oh, that's Harvey. Good morning, everybody. We're learning Chassidus. We're making our way through this Maimon, this discourse. We're learning about the purpose of the tefillin, as well as the purpose of Torah study. Right? We're getting a little esoteric. Good morning, Garrett. A little esoteric right now, as we are in the midst of an explanation as to the impact of Torah on our lives. Here's what happens. What happens is that when you look at life from a one-dimensional perspective, one-dimensional, you see, what do you see? You see there's a world. And then God, I don't know. Maybe there is a God, maybe there's not a God. Maybe one day when I retire and I have a lot of money and I have a lot of free time to worry about it, I'll deal with it then. You know what I mean? I think that's pretty much what a lot of people, how they relate to God, unless they have a crisis. If there's a crisis and there's some illness, some divorce, something horrible comes up, then they need to turn to God and He gets their attention, right? But for most of us, we live in a world where we're very superficial and we deal with what's urgent, not with what's important, right? Comes Chassidus, good morning, Terry and Corey. And Chassidus opens our eyes to what's lying beneath the surface, to the fact, we've learned about the doctrine of perpetual creation, about how God creates the world at every single moment in time. And if God did not create the world at every single moment in time all over again, it would simply cease to exist. It wouldn't be a world. When something's created out of nothing, it has to consistently be maintained in order for it to exist. So suddenly, our relationship with God becomes much more focused when we realize that God is creating us at every single moment. Because now you realize, 1 second, so what's my problem? What's my problem is dealing with my neighbor, dealing with my boss, dealing with my client, right? Dealing with a doctor. When you realize that the real solution to your problems actually lies in God, right? Because God is creating the doctor and creating the neighbor and creating the business at every single moment in time. You're like, oh, okay, we could do this. And then you suddenly become more observant or more religious or more observant of God and observant of mitzvahs. More mindful. That's a good word. It's a very good word. More mindful of the presence of God, right? Now, in much the same way that we can become aroused or awakened to the presence of God in our lives, it works the other way as well, that God also becomes aroused or awakened to us through certain mechanisms. You see, by default, Ram al kol goyim havaya, God is infinitely greater than all the nations. The comparison between God and this world is much greater than the comparison between an earthworm and Albert Einstein. Why? Because the earthworm and Albert Einstein are both creatures of this earth. They're both creatures of this earth. Yeah, they're both creatures created by God. But you talk about God and Albert Einstein, you're talking about a creator versus a creation. They're not even in the same ballpark, right? So God is much, 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 much greater than this world. The world means nothing to God. In much the same way that I don't have a second thought about what the earthworm outside might be thinking right now. It makes no difference to my life. In much the same way, God doesn't care what goes on in this world. He's so much greater. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
For us, it's not so good.
Well, now it's interesting you say, Daniel, for us it's not so good. You see, what do you mean us? Us the Jews, right? Because we the Jews are compared to a sheep surrounded by 70 wolves. Who are the 70 wolves? The 70 nations of the earth. Now, left to our own devices, things don't normally go well, right? We always need the intervention of the shepherd to keep us alive. Who was it that said that the definition of a democracy is not where two wolves and a sheep take a vote on what to have for dinner tonight? Right? I think that was a description of the United Nations, of what really goes on over there. Pretty good, right? But the survival of the sheep depends on the presence of the shepherd. When the shepherd checks out, the sheep normally gets eaten. And that's what happened in the Purim story. God, we turned our backs on God. God turned his back on us. And we were left to the anti-Semitic decrees of Haman and Achashverosh until we turned back to face God and God turned back to face us and we were saved. If God doesn't notice us, if God doesn't care about us, if we're not even a blip on his radar, then how does he create us? Didn't we say that he has to create us at every single moment? So for that, we brought in the analogy of a sleeping person. It's like a person sleepwalking. Have you ever sleepwalked? Yeah, right? It's kind of scary. It's kind of scary when you sleepwalk.
I was not aware of it. I wasn't aware of it, but I was told this morning my grandpa said you were walking around looking for a water fountain.
When you see like one of your kids, when you see one of the kids sleepwalking, it's like terrifying, you imagine waking up and finding blood all over your hands or something, like a knife, God forbid. It's like, whoa, seriously, it's like, you took you heard about the guy, he dreamt about that he ate a giant marshmallow. In the morning, he couldn't find his pillow. Right? So just like a person who's sleepwalking or sleep talking, what happens is that you're alive. You're just not present in any way whatsoever. You don't know what's flying, right? In the same way, that's a metaphor that the Maimer, the discourse here uses to illustrate Hashem's relationship with his world normally. Hashem is like sleep, he's like sleepy related to us. He's like, yeah, I'm creating the world, but with very, very, very minuscule energy, without any focused attention. And now that's going on, so then on the one hand, he's creating us, but at the same time, he's really not focusing his attention on us, which leaves us at the mercy of Elohim, of the laws of nature and the rules of nature. Rules of nature are that the survival of the fittest. The bigger, the stronger, the better trained typically win over the smaller, the weaker, and the less trained, which is the miracle of Hanukkah. Think about it. We say that in the Hanukkah blessing, during that prayer, we say, thank you, God. We acknowledge the miracle that God put the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, and that was the intervention of Hanukkah. Right? Any Jewish holiday is really where God intervenes. He slides into home base, at the 11th hour. His timing is a little off sometimes. I mean, a little much for our nerves. But that's typically every Jewish miracle. He leaves us to the last moment, and then he comes in to save the day, right? Which is great. And then we're grateful for the next, 1,000 years, a few thousand years, make a Jewish holiday, right? You heard about Hitler went into to a palm reader. And he asked the palm reader to read his palm. So she said to him, I see on your palm that you're going to die on a Jewish holiday. Really? Which Jewish holiday am I going to die on? So she said, doesn't matter. Whenever you die, it's going to be a Jewish holiday. So what happens here is that now God doesn't focus his attention on us. How then are we going to get him to focus his attention on us? What do we have to do? That's where Torah comes in. Torah, now this is where we're getting a little spiritual, a little Kabbalistic right now. Torah is where God is aroused. Why? Because Torah is God's wisdom. The wisdom, the intellect, is what inspires the emotion, feeling. What you think impacts or changes or guides the way that you feel, right? If you want to change the way that someone feels about something, then educate them about a certain way. Like in Russia right now, it became illegal to talk about anything about the Ukraine invasion that doesn't fit the party lines. Right? So what does that mean? That means everyone has to, it's brilliant. It's propaganda, because what happens is that everyone has to say, oh yeah, the Ukrainians deserve this somehow, and they started this war somehow, and whatever Putin's propaganda is, causes the people. Yeah, we're going to get rid of the Nazis. Right? So what happens? Everybody now sticks to that mantra, and that causes them to feel like, yeah, these guys deserve it. We've got to go get them. We got to go get them. We got to go save the Jews, right? We got to get the Nazis out of there. Makes no sense. It doesn't matter. But if that's the propaganda, Joseph Goebbels called it, father of propaganda, modern propaganda. May his name be blotted out and erased. He was Hitler's Nazi propagandist. He said that if you say a lie enough times, it then becomes the truth. That's what he said. If you say a lie enough times, it then becomes the truth. So, you people feel what they think about, right? So God also feels what he thinks about. Same thing. God is our mirror. We learned that, right? And that whatever he tells us to do is what he does himself. So just like we have our emotions follow our intellect. Remember, we spoke about the way the spiritual makeup of our soul, which is the 10 attributes, intellect, controlling emotion. They reflect God's 10 spiritual attributes of expression, which is intellect, controlling emotion. So we learned also that God creates the world through his intellect, through his emotion. You need something, Larry?
He's going to fix the lights.
Oh, gotcha. Fantastic. All right. Oh, you got it. So just like God, so God, we learned, and this is a bit of a side point, but God creates the world through his emotion. He creates the world through his emotion. And that's where we get a little technical in the discourse. That God says, it says the world was created in 6 days. It's very important to understand this idea that the 7-day week isn't just a human invention. Have you ever wondered where the 7-day week comes from? Think about it. Every single country in the world, there's a 7-day week. It's amazing. Did somebody come up with this idea somewhere like, let's do 7 days? It's actually built into the making of the universe because the world is created by God's 7 emotions. Therefore, the world was created in 7 days. It's not that God needed time, to build the world. He could have created the world in an instant. But it took 7 days because there were 7 forms of expression. The 7 attributes of our emotion, of God's emotion, which is kindness, strictness, compassion, triumph, humility, connection, and receptiveness, right? These are the 7 attributes through which God created the world. That's why the 7 days of creation, which is amazing to me. Anytime I talk to an atheist, I'm like, you're an atheist? Okay. Why do you celebrate 7 days of the week? Why do you do 7 days? Like, where does this come from? And it becomes a very interesting discussion. I ask an atheist this question. He's like, oh, because that's just the way it is. I'm like, okay, but where did it come from? Oh, it's in the Bible. Uh-huh. All right, interesting. It's like becomes a whole interesting discussion, where stuff that's built into the fabric of the universe is actually rooted in the Bible, and that really stirs up an atheist that is interested in information, as opposed to most of them that are not interested in an answer. So, since God creates the world through his emotion, and since Torah originates in God's intellect, when we study Torah, we arouse God's intellect. And intellect arouses emotion. Therefore, his intellect is aroused when we study Torah. It says in the Gemara, by the way, whenever you study Torah, anything in Torah, the lips of the person that said this Torah move in the grave. It's interesting concept, whatever that means. The lips of the person, if you study Torah from somebody from 500 years ago, Gates of Trust, Rabbeinu B'chaye, something like that, his lips are moving in the grave. You know what I mean? So whatever that means, whatever, maybe spiritually, I don't know. But also it says that when a person studies Torah, then God sits before him. God sits before him and studies with him. God repeats after him. That's what it says. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yoshev Kenegdoi sits before him and studies Torah with him. So when I study Torah, God's intellect, then God's intellect is aroused. What happens to God's intellect is aroused? It's channeled into his emotion. What happens when his emotion is channeled? Bam! That channels God's focus on this earth, which is when he focuses his attention on this earth. Now he intervenes what typically expresses itself as a miracle, like the miracle of Purim, the miracle of Hanukkah. It's really every Jewish story. Yeah, it really is the Purim story, especially the Purim story. But really, it's every Jewish miracle. And I have to say to you, it's not just a miracle like Purim. It's the miracle of my daily life. Let me tell you, running a Chabad house is like insane. If I had to think about, if I knew then what I know now about how hard it is to run a Chabad, I don't think I would ever have done this. I'm serious. If I knew how hard it is, thank God for ignorance. You know what I mean? We don't know what we're getting ourselves into. Same thing with your marriage. Think about it. Think about a lot of your big decisions that you do. You know what I mean? If you knew then what you know now, you probably wouldn't have gone into it. If you think about all the, maybe not your marriage, whatever. No, your marriage, whatever. But if you think about it, I have to tell you, running a Chabad house is like, you have to be a rabbi and an entrepreneur and a counselor and a janitor and a whatever, all the above. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. But I want to tell you, I see miracles like every day. There's a shliach in Odessa, Rabbi Wolf, my cousin, Rabbi Vigler, Rabbi Shneur Vigler, my cousin. He's the deputy of the Chabad of Odessa. So boss, Rabbi Avram Wolf, my cousin tells me a story that in the good days, when life was normal without overhead fireworks, God forbid, and tanks and everything else, he said that, they run an orphanage and there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the shul and a restaurant and a university and all sorts of stuff that they do there. He was telling me that whenever Rabbi Wolf, who's responsible for the budget, whenever he gets overwhelmed or stressed out, he locks himself in a room and he studies Torah. But he throws himself into the Torah like there's nothing else going on in the world. Can you imagine? He's got some crushing deadline of some payment due, and he locks himself in a room and he studies Torah like there's no tomorrow. And my cousin tells me, it always works. Something how he gets a phone call from somebody in San Francisco. It's like, can I wire you $50,000? Something like that, It's an amazing thing. And I have to tell you, I see it every day in my life, that I know that it says in the Torah, in the end of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, Parshas Bechukaisai, Im Bechukaisai Telechu, if you walk in my statutes and you fulfill my mitzvahs, I will give you rain in its time. Rashi explains, what does it mean if you walk in my statutes? He says, it can't be referring to mitzvahs because that's the next phrase. If you fulfill my mitzvahs. So what does it mean if you walk in my statutes? Explains it to mean that you should be toiling in the study of Torah. If you sweat, toil, not just reading Torah like in a lazy boy, but if you sweat, you really, really push yourself to study in the study of Torah more than you're accustomed to. It's like us learning Vyodata, right? For us doing that, it's like, really? Like we can do this? Like really? When we push ourselves, when we meditate and we go deep, right? What happens is that God promises you sweat over Torah, I will give you rain in its time, peace in the land, and all the great blessings that are listed up there in the Torah. The reason is because of what we're learning here today. Because my intellect, my study of Torah arouses God's intellect. God's intellect channels into his emotions. Those emotions express themselves on earth. And that's why every day of running the Chabad, I have to push myself in the study of Torah. Last night I went to sleep late. Something came up very crazy. I went to sleep 1 o'clock in the morning. I woke up late this morning, 5:45. And I needed to push myself. I had 2 kids with me. I was like crazy, but I still needed to learn this very difficult page of Talmud. Very difficult. It was like really hard page of Talmud. And I had to do it because I need to push myself every single day in the study of Torah. I need to. If not, I feel naked. I feel like I'm not, like I've got to put my shoes on or something, So that's how this whole idea works. Let's just take a look at this idea inside the text for a little bit, and we'll take it from there, okay? So I think we're going to try to finish here. We're going to try to finish this chapter here. When page 34, if you have the book, okay? So far we said in the second chapter, we said that creation is powered by God's emotion. Remember 7 days of the week, 7 emotions. And the Torah originates in God's intellect, which is higher than emotion. Now, by contrast, with the emotions, such as the attribute of kindness, we spoke about the fact that whatever, I'm going to skip this part, we did already. Here we are, intellectual attributes. Here, page 36. God's intellectual attributes, by contrast, were not drawn into the creation of the worlds. So creation of the worlds is powered by God's emotion, not by God's intellect. This is true despite that which our sages declared. God created the world with 10 qualities. 10 qualities. 10 qualities would mean intellect and emotion. With wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. That's from the Gemara Chagiga. Right? In a similar vein, Sefer Yetzirah states God created the world with 3 books, Sefer, Sofer, and Sipur, which is explained in Chassidus to mean that Sofer is a level of Chachma idea. Sefer refers to Bina, and Sipur would be Das. Nevertheless, even though it seems in certain places in Torah that the world was created by the 10 attributes, which would mean intellect and emotion, nevertheless, the divine intellect drawn into the divine emotions, and thus into the creation is only a level of intellect that was within the emotions. The intellect that creates the world is really intellect that's part of emotions. It's a little subtle, technical. The essence of intellect, by contrast, stands above the emotions in creation. So intellect itself stands above the world. The intellect that does power creation is like the brain of the emotion. So without getting technical. In the Torah, however, emanates from Chachma, from God's idea, intellect. Therefore, the Torah preceded the world by 2,000 years because the world comes from emotion. And just like emotion is preceded by intellect, so too Torah preceded the world. The Torah is the aspect of I will teach you wisdom, I will teach you understanding, i.e. God's intellect. And they preceded the world, i.e. God's emotional attributes. Hence, the expression 2,000 in Hebrew is alpayim. For alpayim is etymologically related to the word alefcha, I will teach you. When it says 2,000 years, the Torah comes before the world. The word 2,000 in Hebrew also means I will teach you. It means wisdom. That word etymologically can mean 2,000 or it can mean I will teach you wisdom. So it means that the Torah is wisdom before the world. That's basically what we're saying over here in this concept. That's how this idea works. And that's where we're going to wrap it up over here today because we just finished the second of 3 chapters of this discourse. Bear in mind that, the reason why I want to write, again, a book on this is because when you read the text itself, it can get too technical. And I need to be able to guide the reader in being able to discuss where this is going without getting lost in the weeds, okay? If you have any comments or feedback, please do send me an email to rabbi@jewishgardens.com. That's rabbi@jewishgardens.com, especially if you've read my first book on Viadata. I am formulating this book right now in time for my son's bar mitzvah, God willing, which is in 5 months. So if you are able to give me any feedback, I would love to hear from you. Please, thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful day. Shalom. Rob, when you do call